There exists a peculiar human experience that defies our culture's relentless pursuit of happiness. Those moments when we deliberately choose to sink into sadness, when we actively resist the world's demands for perpetual optimism, when we find ourselves craving the very emotion society teaches us to avoid. This isn't depression speaking, nor is it the acute pain of fresh heartbreak. Instead, it is something far more nuanced and profound. The gentle pull toward melancholy, that bittersweet companion that arrives uninvited yet somehow feels like coming home. Picture this. You wake up on an ordinary Tuesday morning, and despite having no particular reason for sorrow, you feel drawn to it like a moth to flame. The sunlight streaming through your window feels too bright, too demanding of cheerfulness you simply don't possess. Your phone buzzes with messages from well-meaning friends, but their enthusiasm feels foreign, almost aggressive in its insistence on positivity. What you want, what you desperately need, is permission to exist in this liminal space between contentment and despair, to inhabit the quiet cathedral of your own contemplative sadness. This phenomenon puzzles us because we've been conditioned to view any deviation from happiness as a problem requiring immediate solution. We live in a culture that treats sadness like a malfunction, something to be debugged and optimized away. Yet, here we are, intelligent beings capable of choosing our emotional states, actively selecting the very feeling we're told to avoid. The question isn't whether this makes us broken, it is whether this impulse toward melancholy might actually be one of our most sophisticated emotional responses. Consider the texture of melancholy itself. Unlike the sharp edges of anger or the suffocating weight of despair, melancholy moves through us like slow water, carrying with it fragments of memory, whispers of longing, and the accumulated dust of experiences we never fully processed. It doesn't demand immediate action or resolution. Instead, it asks us to simply be present with what is, to acknowledge the full spectrum of human experience, without rushing toward the next emotional destination. The roots of our melancholic tendencies often stretch back to childhood, though not always in ways we might expect. Many of us learned early that our emotional needs were inconvenient, that tears were burdens, that vulnerability was weakness. We became experts at emotional camouflage, painting smiles over sorrow, enthusiasm over exhaustion, strength over the very human need for comfort and understanding. The child who was told to stop crying or be strong didn't stop needing to cry. They simply learned to postpone it indefinitely. Years later, when life finally offers us the safety and space to feel, melancholy emerges as our psyche is way of saying, remember what you never allowed yourself to process. It is the emotional equivalent of finally exhaling after holding your breath for decades. The sadness we crave isn't random or pathological. It is purposeful, carrying within it the accumulated weight of every tear we swallowed, every comfort we denied ourselves, every moment we chose performance over authenticity. This explains why melancholy often visits during periods of relative stability, when the immediate crises have passed, when the external demands for strength have temporarily lifted. Our inner world finally has permission to speak. The timing seems counterintuitive. Shouldn't we feel sad when things are actually going wrong? But melancholy operates on a different timeline than circumstantial sadness. It emerges not in response to present difficulties, but as a delayed reaction to past deprivations, a gentle rebellion against years of emotional suppression. The neuroscience behind this phenomenon is fascinating. When we consistently suppress emotions, our nervous system doesn't simply forget them, it stores them, creating what researchers call an emotional backlog. This isn't metaphorical, it is measurable. Chronic emotional suppression creates patterns of tension, hypervigilance, and exhaustion that persist until the underlying emotions are finally acknowledged and processed. Melancholy, in this context, becomes a form of nervous system regulation, a way of discharging accumulated emotional energy that has nowhere else to go. But melancholy offers us more than just psychological housekeeping. It provides access to a different kind of consciousness, one that our productivity-obsessed culture rarely acknowledges. In melancholic states, time moves differently. We notice subtleties that escape us during periods of forced cheerfulness, the way afternoon light falls across an empty room, the particular quality of silence that follows rain, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air between people. This heightened sensitivity isn't accidental. It is melancholy's gift. a reminder that depth of feeling often correlates with depth of perception. Throughout history, artists, writers, and philosophers have recognized melancholy as a doorway to creative insight. The Portuguese have a word, saudade, that captures this perfectly, a deep emotional state of longing for something absent, a bittersweet awareness of the impermanence of all things. This isn't depression. It is a sophisticated emotional response that acknowledges both beauty and loss as fundamental aspects of existence. When we allow ourselves to inhabit this space, we often discover that our capacity for joy expands rather than contracts. It is as if by fully feeling our sadness, we create more room in our hearts for all emotions. The desire to be sad also serves a crucial social function, though we rarely recognize it as such. In a world where everyone is expected to maintain a facade of constant wellness, choosing vulnerability becomes a radical act. When we allow others to witness our melancholy, not as a cry for help, but as a natural expression of our humanity, we give them permission to drop their own masks. This creates opportunities for genuine connection that superficial positivity simply cannot provide. Think about the conversations that have changed your life. How many of them began with someone admitting their struggles, their confusion, their sadness? Authentic intimacy requires the courage to be seen in our imperfection, and melancholy provides a pathway to that courage. It says, I am not always strong, and that is okay. I am not always happy, and that is human. I contain multitudes, including sorrow, and I refuse to apologize for my complexity. This is particularly important for those who grew up as emotional caretakers, the children who learn to prioritize others' feelings over their own. These individuals often carry a deep exhaustion from years of emotional labor, a bone-deep tiredness that no amount of rest can cure, because it stems not from physical exertion, but from the constant suppression of their own needs. For them, melancholy becomes a form of self-advocacy, a way of finally saying, I matter too. My sadness matters too. I deserve the same compassion I've given to everyone else. The healing power of melancholy lies partly in its refusal to rush. Unlike our culture's quick-fix mentality, melancholy operates on geological time. It doesn't promise immediate relief or instant transformation. Instead, it offers something more valuable, the opportunity to develop a different relationship with discomfort, to learn that we can survive, even thrive, in emotional complexity. This patience with our own process becomes a form of self-compassion that extends far beyond moments of sadness. There is also something profoundly democratic about melancholy. It doesn't discriminate based on success, wealth, or social status. The CEO and the janitor, the celebrity and the unknown artist, all are equally susceptible to these moments of existential tenderness. In a world increasingly divided by external circumstances, melancholy reminds us of our shared humanity, our universal vulnerability to loss, longing, and the passage of time. But we must distinguish between melancholy and its more destructive cousins. Depression tells us that nothing will ever change, that we are fundamentally flawed, that hope is an illusion. Melancholy, by contrast, whispers that change is the only constant, that our flaws are part of our beauty, that hope and sorrow can coexist in the same heart. Depression isolates, melancholy connects. Depression numbs, melancholy sensitizes. Depression convinces us we're alone in our suffering. Melancholy reveals suffering as a universal human experience. The key to working with melancholy lies in learning to surf its waves rather than being pulled under by them. This means developing what psychologists call emotional granularity, the ability to distinguish between different types of sadness and respond appropriately to each. When melancholy visits, we can ask ourselves, what is this sadness trying to tell me? What part of my experience needs acknowledgement? What aspect of my past requires gentle attention? Sometimes the answer is simple. We need to cry. Not the desperate sobbing of crisis, but the cleansing tears of release. These tears carry with them years of accumulated tension, unexpressed grief, and unacknowledged loss. They're not a sign of weakness, but of wisdom, our body's way of washing away what no longer serves us. In many cultures, tears are seen as sacred, a form of prayer that requires no words. Perhaps it is time we reclaimed this understanding. Other times, melancholy calls us to solitude, not the isolation of withdrawal, but the intentional aloneness of reflection. In our hyper-connected world, we rarely give ourselves permission to simply exist without input, without stimulation, without the constant chatter of other voices. Melancholy creates a natural boundary around this need, protecting our right to inner silence. In these quiet moments, we often discover insights that elude us during busier times, solutions that emerge only when we stop trying to force them. The practice of honoring melancholy also involves learning to communicate about it differently. Instead of apologizing for our sadness or rushing to explain it away, we can learn to speak about it as we would any other natural phenomenon. "I am feeling melancholic today" carries a different energy than "I am sorry I am being such a downer." The first acknowledges a temporary emotional weather pattern. The second pathologizes a normal human experience. This shift in language reflects a deeper shift in understanding. When we stop treating melancholy as a problem to be solved, we can begin to appreciate it as information to be received. What is this sadness revealing about our values, our needs, our unfinished emotional business? How might this temporary descent into sorrow be preparing us for a more authentic ascent into joy? The spiritual dimensions of melancholy deserve particular attention. Many wisdom traditions speak of the dark night of the soul, periods of spiritual dryness or emotional difficulty that precede breakthrough and growth. These traditions understand that transformation often requires a kind of composting process, where old ways of being must decompose before new growth becomes possible. Melancholy can serve this function, creating the psychological conditions necessary for genuine renewal. In this context, the desire to be sad becomes a form of spiritual intelligence, an intuitive understanding that some experiences require us to go through rather than around. Just as a seed must be buried in darkness before it can reach toward light, some aspects of our psychological development require periods of conscious descent into our own depths. Melancholy provides both the invitation and the vehicle for this journey. The creative potential of melancholy cannot be overstated. Some of humanity's most profound art, literature, and music has emerged from these liminal spaces between joy and sorrow. This isn't because suffering automatically creates beauty, but because melancholy opens us to nuances of experience that more extreme emotional states obscure. In melancholic consciousness, we become exquisitely sensitive to subtlety, metaphor, and meaning. We notice connections that escape us during periods of intense happiness or deep despair. This creative sensitivity extends beyond formal artistic expression. Melancholy can inspire us to rearrange our living spaces, to write letters we never send, to take long walks without destination, to engage in what psychologists call meaning-making activities. These seemingly small acts of creation help us process complex emotions and integrate difficult experiences into our ongoing life narrative. The relationship between melancholy and memory is particularly rich. Unlike traumatic memories, which often feel frozen in time, melancholic memories have a fluid, dreamlike quality. They allow us to revisit the past, not to change it, but to understand it differently, to find new meaning in old experiences. This process of recontextualization is crucial for psychological healing and growth. For many people, melancholy also serves as a bridge between their public and private selves. In our professional lives, we're often required to maintain emotional equilibrium regardless of our inner weather. Melancholy provides a counterbalance to this performance, a space where we can acknowledge the full complexity of our experience without judgment or the need for immediate action. The seasonal nature of melancholy is worth noting as well. Many people report increased melancholic feelings during transitional periods. The end of summer, the approach of winter, anniversaries of significant events. This isn't coincidental. Melancholy often emerges when we're processing change, loss, or the passage of time. It helps us metabolize these universal experiences, transforming them from sources of anxiety into opportunities for deeper understanding. Learning to work skillfully with melancholy also involves developing what we might call emotional hospitality, the ability to welcome difficult feelings without being overwhelmed by them. This doesn't mean wallowing or indulging in sadness for its own sake, but rather creating space for these emotions to move through us naturally. Like weather systems, emotions have their own rhythms and life cycles. When we try to force them to change before they're ready, we often prolong their stay. The practice of emotional hospitality might involve simple rituals, lighting a candle, when sadness arrives, making tea and sitting quietly with our feelings, or taking a bath while allowing tears to flow. These small acts of self-care communicate to our psyche that all parts of our experience are welcome, that we don't need to be different than we are in this moment to be worthy of love and attention. As we develop greater comfort with melancholy, we often discover that it enhances rather than diminishes our capacity for joy. This might seem counterintuitive, but emotional range works like physical flexibility. The more we can stretch in one direction, the more we can stretch in others. People who can fully inhabit their sadness often report more vivid experiences of happiness, as if their willingness to feel deeply in one domain increases their sensitivity across the entire emotional spectrum. The social implications of normalizing melancholy are profound. In a culture that often treats sadness as a personal failing, choosing to honor our melancholic moments becomes a form of resistance. It challenges the toxic positivity that insists we should always be grateful, always optimistic, always moving forward. It asserts our right to the full range of human experience, including the difficult emotions that connect us to our deepest humanity. This doesn't mean we should romanticize suffering or seek out sadness for its own sake. Rather, it means developing the wisdom to recognize when melancholy is serving a purpose in our lives, and the courage to honor that purpose rather than rushing to escape it. Sometimes the most radical thing we can do is simply allow ourselves to feel what we feel without immediately trying to change it. The integration of melancholy into a healthy emotional life requires ongoing practice and refinement. We must learn to distinguish between productive sadness that moves us toward healing and destructive patterns that keep us stuck. We must develop the skills to communicate about our emotional needs clearly, and the wisdom to know when to seek support and when to sit alone with our experience. Perhaps most importantly, we must remember that melancholy is not a destination but a passage. It is a temporary dwelling place that offers its own gifts and insights before naturally giving way to other emotional states. By learning to inhabit this space with grace and curiosity rather than fear and resistance, we develop a more mature and nuanced relationship with the full spectrum of human experience. In the end, the desire to be sad reveals something beautiful about human nature, our capacity to find meaning in difficulty, to transform pain into wisdom, and to use our own suffering as a bridge to greater compassion for others. Melancholy reminds us that we are not machines designed for constant productivity and happiness, but complex beings capable of profound depth and feeling. When we honor our melancholic moments, we honor the totality of who we are. We acknowledge that our sadness, like our joy, is sacred. We recognize that our tears, like our laughter, are prayers. And we remember that our willingness to feel deeply, even when it hurts, is not a weakness, but perhaps our greatest strength, the very quality that makes us most beautifully, irreducibly human. So the next time melancholy comes calling, consider welcoming it as you would an old friend bearing important news. Listen to what it has to say. Let it remind you of your depth, your sensitivity, your capacity for profound feeling. Allow it to wash away what no longer serves you and prepare the ground for whatever wants to grow next in the garden of your heart. For in learning to dance with our sadness, we learn to dance with life itself in all its terrible, beautiful complexity.